Hello and welcome to China Now. I am Stanley Koblaku. On today's program, we track rising tension in global trade, a humanitarian response to tragedy, emerging risks in artificial intelligence, and a breakthrough in robotics that could change how humans carry heavy load. Now, trade tensions between China and the United States are once again in focus. New investigations launched by Washington are raising questions about the future of global supply chains and stability of ongoing negotiations. Now, at the same time, developments in technology and innovation continue to reshape everyday life, bringing both opportunity and risks.
Hello and welcome to this week's China Currents. Here's what we are covering today. The US breaks the trade war truce with the new investigations targeting Chinese goods. China donates $200,000 after a deadly missile strike on a school in Iran. China's security agency warns of risks from a hot new AI tool called OpenClaw. And Chinese scientists built a real-life centaur robot that carries heavy loads for you. Let's start with China-US trade. On the 11th and 12th of March, the U.S. Trade Representative launched a series of trade investigations under a law known as Section 301. It first targeted 16 economies, including China, claiming they had overcapacity, meaning they produce more than they consume. A day later, the investigation expanded to 60 economies, this time over allegations of using forced labor in manufacturing. These moves came right in the middle of a new round of US-China trade talks in Paris. China pushed back hard. Its Commerce Ministry issued two statements, on 13th of March and on the 16th of March, with increasingly strong language. A spokesperson called the overcapacity argument groundless. In a globalized world, he said, both production and consumption cross borders. Calling any output above domestic demand overcapacity is simply protectionist thinking. The spokesperson also pointed out that the World Trade Organization has already ruled that Section 301 tariff violates international trade rules. By using this tool again, the US is putting its own law above global rules, making a bad situation worse and threatening supply chains worldwide. On forced labor, China noted the irony. The US itself has never ratified the International Labour Organization's 1930 Convention on Forced Labor, yet it uses this issue to block trade. China has formally protested to the US and urged it to return to dialogue. We will keep watching this story. Now to the situation in Iran. A missile strike recently hit a primary school in southern Iran's Hormozgan province, killing more than 160 girls. On the 13th of March, China's foreign ministry strongly condemned the US attack. Spokesman Guo Jiakun said the attacks on civilians, specifically on schools and children, are a serious violation of international humanitarian law and cross the line of human conscience. China also announced emergency aid. The Red Cross Society of China will send $200,000 to Iran's Red Crescent to help comfort and compensate the families of the victims. We express our deep condolences over the deaths at the schools and extend our sincere sympathy to the family, the spokesman said. Next, let's look at a trending tech story in China. An open-source AI tool called OpenClaw has taken the world by storm. It's not just a chat box, it can actually take control of your computer, manage files, write emails, and even learn your habits to offer help around the clock. Major Chinese tech platforms have already rolled out ready-to-use versions, so even people with no programming skills can try it out. But on the 17th of March, China's security agency stepped in with a warning. It released a safety guide outlining 4 big risks. In China, people have nicknamed these AI agents lobsters, a playful internet term for the digital helpers that can use their claws to grab and handle tasks for you. So the guide's advice on staying safe is framed as tips for raising your lobster. Risk number 1, losing control of your computer. To work properly, the AI often needs top-level access to your system. That means a single mistake could wipe out important files. Worse, hackers could quietly take over your device through the AI. Risk number 2, data theft. Some users hand over passwords, personal details, or financial information without thinking twice. If the AI is breached or that data is exposed. Risk number 3, your voice being hijacked. These AI agents can post on social media on their own. If a hacker takes control, they could use your accounts to spread fake news or run scams in your name. Risk number 4, security gaps. Many of these tools lack regular updates and patches. Hackers can exploit weak plugins to sneak past security and steal your data, even more quietly than traditional computer viruses. That said, the guide doesn't say to avoid the technology altogether. With the right settings, like limiting permissions, checking plugin sources, and keep the AI's access restricted, these digital helpers can still be safe and useful in everyday life. Finally, from an invisible digital worker to a very visible mechanical one. This week, scientists at a university in southern China unveiled a load-carrying robot called the Centaur. The research was published in a top robotic journal and is drawing global attention. Think about hiking with a 20-kilogram backpack. That's about 44 pounds. You get tired fast. Traditional leg braces, known as exoskeletons, can help, but studies show they only reduce your body energy used by about 10%. Not much relief. The team at Southern University of Science and Technology tried something completely different. Instead of attaching the device to your legs, they built a separate robot body with 2 mechanical legs. It connects to the user's waist through a flexible link, so the person and machine move together like a centaur, the mythical creature that is half human and half horse. In tests, the robot handled more than half of a 20-kilogram load. That means the person only felt about 10 kilograms, and their energy use dropped by 35%, 3 times better than traditional exoskeletons. The potential is huge. Rescue workers carrying gear over rough ground, construction workers moving heavy materials, warehouse staff, and even hikers. All of them could one day use these mechanical horse legs to go further with less effort. And that is all for today's China Current. See you at the same time next week.
The situation in the Middle East continued to escalate with growing concern over the collapse of diplomacy and the risks of a wider regional conflict. According to geopolitical analyst Pepe Escobar, the current crisis reflects the deeper structural tensions, not just between individual countries but across global power blocs. He argues that recent events point to a breakdown in diplomatic norms and a shift towards a far more unpredictable international order. Here is Pepe Escobar with his perspective.
We have one chance for this war to stop, is that Iran will make the costs for both the United States and Israel totally prohibitive. And they will have once again to pick up the phone and say, okay, we stop. This attack, first of all, started in the middle of negotiations. There was a deal already on the table in these indirect negotiations between the Americans and Iranians in Oman. Iran had made serious concessions regarding their civilian nuclear program, committed not to enrich uranium anymore, committed to IAEA inspections. And on a Saturday morning in Tehran, around 9 o'clock in the morning, 9:30 in the morning, Ayatollah Khamenei, the supreme leader of Iran, and some members of the Security Council and top military leadership, they were gathered together in Khamenei's own residence to finalize and fine-tune the last details of this proposal, which would be sent back to the negotiators in Oman. And typical of the extremely vicious Israeli regime, when they saw that, according to their own calculations, which is something that they do all the time, everybody was on the same table, they struck Khamenei's compound in Tehran and they killed several top officials, including Ayatollah Khamenei himself and members of his own family, including his granddaughter. So the whole thing started with deceit and infringement, a serious infringement of any diplomatic convention and international law. So it started with the murder, just like our current decade, the raging 20s, as I described it in the beginning, started also with a murder, also ordered by Trump against Commander Soleimani, who was on a diplomatic mission in Iraq. So nothing like that can stun anybody around the world because this is the modus operandi, not only of this president, megalomaniac narcissist, but especially this international Zionist axis, which is, of course, theoretically led by Tel Aviv, but it includes Zionists, Atlanticist Zionists from both sides of the Atlantic with global ramifications. So now West Asia, which is the correct denomination, is at war with unforeseen consequences. Vicious, day by day, it gets extremely serious. As I talk to you, we are on day 4 of the war, and the possibility of horrible things are happening regionally, it's absolutely enormous. But the first two very, very important imperatives of this war is what the American-Israeli axis wanted was regime change. It did not happen from the beginning. So it was a failure from the beginning because the Iranian response started half an hour after the decapitation strike against Ayatollah Khamenei in Tehran. And the response is across the board. It's relentless. And Iran has not even started to use their last generation missiles. This is something that's starting now on day 4. They will not negotiate with the Americans because there is nothing to negotiate. And this was explicitly stated by Ali Larijani, the secretary of the Iranian Security Council. Number 2, they will increase their response, their counterpunch against this vicious start of the war against both Israel and both American military bases everywhere, and the attacks against US military bases, CIA installations, CIA cells, hotels, which are gathering American military personnel that were transferred from the US military bases, they will continue non-stop. So this is a regional war now. It's not a war of the US and Israel against Iran. It's a war of US Israel against Iran, and Iran turned into a war against the US all over West Asia. So nobody knows how this is going to end. The perspectives are harrowing. For West Asia as a whole, this is the start of a completely new, different situation, and nobody knows what's going to be. It could end with the expulsion of the United States of all bases and intel installations all across West Asia, or it could end with Iran being destroyed, which is something that the Americans would do in a flash. First of all, because they skew completely diplomacy. They don't even know what diplomacy means. And now this is an empire completely out of control. It's an empire, as I describe it, an empire of chaos, which it was, an empire of plunder, which has been especially under Donald Trump, and an empire of permanent strikes, and an empire of if you don't abide by our laws, we're going to kill everybody. So this is where we are now. It's harrowing, it's distressing, it's in many aspects unforeseen, and it's very, very sad for the international states of affair. The most important thing, international law is dead. This is an empire out of control, and this is a barbarian empire, as China defines barbarians. This is worse than any barbarian empire on earth because this is a nuclear armed and armed to their teeth barbarian empire. There are no strategic calculations by the Trump administration because they don't do strategy to start with. They barely do tactics and they don't do diplomacy. This is something that China has to be very much aware of, especially now considering that Trump, in principle, is going to visit China in early April. So Russians already learn by themselves how the Americans don't do diplomacy. They use diplomacy as weapons, not as diplomacy. The Russian example is now crystal clear. They have been using negotiations on a possible ceasefire or deal in Ukraine, and even a promise of maybe in the future reset of US-Russia relations. But at the same time, they are still sending weapons and intelligence, especially via NATO, to Ukraine so Ukraine can attack targets and assets inside the Russian Federation. So any illusion that this administration and of course the industrial military complex in the US wants peace with Russia, it's absolutely false. I just came back, I was in Moscow last week doing a series of very important interviews with top players, diplomatic, military, the former prime minister of Ukraine, for that matter, that I interviewed in Moscow last week, the former prime minister before Maidan from 2010 to 2014. And there are no illusions. And there are no illusions among the Security Council in Moscow and, of course, with President Putin. So the same should apply to the Chinese leadership all the way to President Xi Jinping. And there should be no illusions that they are dealing with any diplomatic ballet coming from the Americas. No. Once again, this administration, which is completely controlled by a Zionist axis, which is America, Israel, but Atlanticist, going all across Western Europe. They don't care about the rest of the world, period. They want total control. And because this is an empire that is going down, with debts that are unpayable, with the possibility of, in fact, it's already going on, but it's going to get much worse, a civil war inside the United States. It's a completely polarized country where now we have de facto militias, federal militias, federally empowered militias all across the United States. For them, international law and even law inside the United States, they don't care. They are at the last stage of a decaying empire. When you know that you are going down and you want the rest of the world to go down with you. And this war, there is an element of this war, of provoking this war, to rearrange the international chessboard and even rearrange the fact that the United States cannot pay their debts. So how do you escape from that? You launch a war and you pray that you're going to change everything. So there could not be a more dangerous moment for the world that we are living now. This could be the preamble to what could become World War III in the long run. There's no question about that because we see two camps that are clashing directly and indirectly. I wrote about this in one of my second to last book was about that. The title of the book in the United States is Eurasia Against NATO-Stan. NATO-Stan is an acronym, I'm sorry, that defines the space, the NATO space, which is the United States, Canada, across the Atlantic to Western Europe. And of course, there is a playful element to it. I described it as a country, as a huge country, NATO-Stan. And Eurasia, of course, the two most important players in Eurasia are China and Russia. And China and Russia are also the leaders of BRICS and also the leaders of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, which are the two most important multilateral organizations who want a new world, a new system of international relations. So we have the two camps already fighting each other, especially indirectly. And now they are fighting directly in Iran. Iran is a full member of BRICS. Iran is a full member of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. Iran has strategic partnerships with both Russia and China. So this is an attack essentially against Iran, Russia, and China, and the rest of the global south, and the BRICS especially. Because attacking Iran and trying to get regime change in Iran, or trying to destroy Iran, or trying to install a puppet in Iran, from the point of view of Russia and China, is an absolute disaster, because it blows up at the same time a great deal of the new Silk Roads, of the Belt and Road Initiative. And Iran is a crucial partner for China. It blows up the North-South corridor, which links three BRICS, Russia, Iran, and India. I was in Iran last year, and I did a documentary the first documentary in English about the corridor. And I hope this documentary will be shown in China. And this new corridor is extremely important for these three BRICS, and China could also be part of this corridor, because China could use the port of Chabahar in southern Iran as well as, I would say, an extra maritime corridor for China. So they are trying to blow up BRICS from the inside, because Iran is a full BRICS member. They are trying to blow up the SCO from the inside, especially because 24 hours or a little more before the attack, before the decapitation strike against Ayatollah Khamenei, Prime Minister Modi was fraternizing with the criminal Prime Minister of Israel and asserting that Israel and India are very, very, very close. This, by definition, already blows up BRICS. This is something that Russia and China simply cannot accept inside a multilateral organization. So the fact that this war now is going on, it's a war on multiple levels, not only against Iran. So we know that Russia and China are helping Iran in ways that we see, and especially in ways that we don't see, because it's in their own interest, Russian and Chinese, to Iran must resist, because this is a war against all of them and against the global south as a whole. And that explains why all across the global south, 80% of the global population, support for Iran is enormous. And everybody understands why this war was launched and what the Americans want. They want total control of everything, not to mention total control of oil and gas sold in US dollars. This is the key geoeconomic factor. They cannot tolerate Iran selling lots of energy, oil and gas, and especially to Asia as a whole, to India, to China, to Japan, to South Korea, outside of the US dollar. So they need to smash Iran, and Iran has to be subdued. And Iran, of course, they look around the geopolitical chessboard, and they took very, very serious decision. They said, no, we are not going down. And if we go down fighting, and there is nothing left to negotiate, because we were already negotiated when we were attacked. The key factor from now on is going to be the role of Russia, because Russia is trusted by every actor in West Asia as serious negotiators, diplomats, and capable of providing a military umbrella, which is something that when this war is over, we all hope this war will be over after at least a few days. It could go on for weeks. And the Americans are threatening that this war will last for a long time. And this will be horrible for their own economy. But obviously, they don't have strategic considerations. It's no wonder, for instance, that two of the top players in West Asia, MBS in Saudi Arabia and MBZ in United Arab Emirates, they have been on the phone with President Putin. So obviously, there were no leaks on the substance We can be sure that these were very serious dialogues, including, of course, the fact that the UAE and Qatar are also lobbying the Americans to stop this war now because we are suffering and then we can be completely destroyed as well. But the role of Russia is important because Russia, if there is a realignment in West Asia, the top provider of security will be Russia. It won't be the United States anymore. Of course, if that happens, the United States will probably attack all of these West Asian nations. They don't care anymore because now they are an empire of permanent attack and plunder. But of course, if Russia steps in, the Americans will have to think twice or three times before doing anything. And this fits into a national security concept in Russia, which I was discussing last week when I was in Moscow. Greater Eurasia Partnership. The Chinese have the Belt and Road Initiative, which is also a geopolitical concept. Means China trading with everybody. Anybody can be a partner of the Belt and Road Initiative. And the objective of China is to have good commercial relations with the whole planet. The Russians, they don't think in terms of the whole planet, but they think in terms of Eurasia, the mega continent. By the way, Europe is also part of Eurasia. Europe is a peninsula of the Eurasia continent. But the most important part of Eurasia, of course, is the heartland, as we call it, for 100 years at least, including Russia, China, India, Pakistan, all the Central Asian countries, and includes Turkey as well, which is a very complicated case because Turkey is a NATO member. But sooner or later, Turkey will see that their future lies with Eurasia, not as a colony of the West, right? So the Russians can easily convince all these West Asian nations that, look, if you saw how the Americans treated you during this war, you saw how Iran was attacking US military bases in your own territory because you gave this territory to the Americans. The Americans didn't give you anything in return. Nothing. And they treated you like, stray dogs during this war. They don't care. The only thing that they care about is Israel. So this will be very easy for Russia to convince West Asian nations, important ones, including Saudi Arabia and the Emirates, that look, if you need a new security arrangement, we can provide it. We have and Russia has everything it takes to provide the security arrangement. And this would include West Asia into this greater Eurasia partnership. I discussed this once again in Moscow last week, and they see Eurasia as a whole, and they include West Asia, which for the moment is American territory. But now this war is proving to the rulers in different, the petromonarchies, let's put it this way, across West Asia, that their future is not with the US because the US doesn't care about them, just uses them. Well, the Americans, instead of getting their regime change, which was what the Israelis sold to President Trump, and because he's controlled by Zionists, especially, and he's surrounded by Zionists, he bought it instantly. They didn't get it. What they got is Iran that is even more radically anti-American in the sense of we're going to fight you to death. And I'm not exaggerating. This is a fight to the limit. That's why it's so crucial, not only for West Asia, but for the whole global South. Iran is fighting on behalf of the global South. This is one of the key lessons of this war, because the global South understands that the empire now is in a terminal phase. It's totally out of control. And in a flash, they can decide to kidnap a president, kill a head of state, invade a sovereign country, plunder the resources anywhere they want across the planet, as long, of course, if it's not Russia or China, because they don't have the guts to do this against Russia or China. So Iran now has, during this week, we're going to have a new supreme leader in Iran. At the moment that we're speaking, the negotiations are already being conducted by three very important members. That, let's say, they are the caretaker body that is fulfilling the role of the supreme leader. We have the president of Iran, we have the head of the judiciary, and we have a jurist, Ayatollah Arafi, very well prepared. And the three of them are organizing the government, and then the council of experts, 88 members, will vote and elect the new supreme leader, which is going to be much more. It's not the correct denomination would not be radical. The correct denomination would be completely assertive in terms of Iran will not submit to any American diktat. This was something that was already happening with Khamenei, but Khamenei, he allowed negotiations. Now that the Iranians saw for themselves that negotiations do not matter, that's it. So it's a frontal clash. So there are two options, once again, and the options are dire. Either the US destroys Iran, and I mean destroy, even destroys the infrastructure of Iran, like they did with Iraq in 2003. I was there. I saw it for myself. Or Iran forces the US to call for a ceasefire. And it's very, very important for all our Chinese audience. I hope most of you know about that. On day one of the attack on Iran, Trump was already looking for a ceasefire. The White House called Italian diplomats, and through an Italian channel, they sent a message to Tehran, okay, we stop now. Can we stop now and we start negotiating again? And the Iranian response was very simple, no. Why? Because the negotiations were going on, and in the middle of negotiations, they killed the supreme leader. There is nothing to negotiate. So the new Iranian government under a new supreme leader, there is a strong possibility that they can revoke the previous fatwas and go for a nuclear war. And the confrontation with the US will be absolutely total, at least during the Trump administration, which is already in shambles. And with this war, it's practically certain they're going to lose the midterms elections in the US. And we're going to have the last 2 years of the Trump administration is going to be a lame duck president. And of course, the possibility of the Democrats coming back to power in the US would imply that at least some sort of adult negotiation with Iran would be possible, like it was during the Obama years, when they had the JCPOA, the Iran nuclear deal, discussed and approved in Vienna and then ratified by the United Nations. And afterwards, it was broken by Donald Trump in his first presidency. So this would be the only possibility of the return of some sort of dialogue between the US and Iran. The problem is we still have almost 3 years of a completely out of control, no strategy, no nothing, Trump administration. There are no possible solutions for this war because this is an existential war as defined by the Iranians themselves. So obviously, the possibility of a solution midterm, there's only one possibility, which is what in the US we call taco. Trump always chickens out. Taco means when he is in trouble, he leaves and he changes the narrative and he starts something different. Very important. This already happened on day one. It could happen during this week. It could happen in the beginning of next week for one very special reason, because we are following two parallel tracks on the war. Track number one, Iran has enough ballistic missiles and drones to keep attacking Israel and US military installations, not only for weeks, perhaps for months. On the other side, the Americans and the Israelis, they have a limited amount of interceptors and air defense mechanisms that could be exhausted by next week. And this also applies to all the Gulf petromonarchies. So then after that, Iran will be absolutely free to keep hammering Israel and US military bases, CIA cells, etc., keep going. And they have not even started to use their most sophisticated hypersonic missiles. So we have these two parallel tracks. And the big question now is, which one will be exhausted first? That's where we are. And this will be, of course, conditioning the possibility of a truce or the war being stopped. But the Iranians also know that even if the war is stopped, the Americans will go back to this war later, which is exactly what happened after the 12-day war last summer. 8 months later, that's where we are now. It's the war that was not finished by the 12-day war, when we should all remember Israeli generals called the White House and said, make them stop. We are being hammered. So it was the Israelis that called for the end of the war, because they knew that if it went on for another few, Israel would be destroyed. So we are back to the same situation. Of course, it's much more harrowing, horrible, and I would say even apocalyptic now than it was last year, because now it's really a do or die confrontation. Well, it's very heartening to know that in Chinese social media, which is an enormous universe, most people totally understand what this war is all about. And of course, Iran needs to apply any measure of strategic deterrence that they can. And fortunately for Iran, they have this enormous arsenal of ballistic missiles and drones, which of course at least counteracting the, of course, we cannot disguise it, the overwhelming firepower of the empire of chaos of the United States. And of course, diplomatically, we can say that Iran is supported by the whole global south, but that does not change what's happening on the ground, of course. The only way to make, I would say, at least people with some sort of critical thinking in this axis, I would not say even axis, in the United States. In Israel, is impossible because it's a bunch of apocalyptic fanatics, in fact, is to elevate the cost of this war. This war is already hemorrhaging a lot of money and a lot of weapons out of the United States. In the next few days, the cost can become unbearable. And of course, US public opinion is already against the war. According to the latest polls, over 60% of the US population. So Trump, by all measures, has already lost the next midterm elections. He promised there will be no more wars when he came to power, and he launches a war that can convulse. It is already convulsing the whole of West Asia and could go completely out of control if it goes on. So this is part of Iran's strategic deterrence. The problem is those fanatics in Israel, they will never give up. When we have the American ambassador in Israel basically saying the quiet part out loud, that Israel has the right to annex everything in West Asia, now it's clear to everybody that this was what they always wanted, and they will never give up. So Iran, Russia knows that, China knows that, the global south knows that, but how do you use very well-armed fanatics and supported by the United States? That's what makes the situation and the equation so complicated. So once again, in the next few days, we have one chance for this war to stop, is that Iran will make the costs for both the United States and Israel totally prohibitive. And they will have once again to pick up the phone and say, okay, we stop.
Now, beyond the battlefield, shifts are also taking place in global economics and diplomacy. As relationship between major powers evolve, questions are being raised about whether the world is moving toward a new balance, one defined in less by ideology and more by economic realities. Economist and geopolitical analyst Louis Vicente Garvey offers insights into how the United States and China are recalibrating their relationship and what that means for global markets, trade, and the future of international cooperation. Let's hear from him.
Look, I think when President Trump met with President Xi in Busan in South Korea a few months ago, President Trump very purposefully talked about a G2 world, a world with essentially two superpowers, which, to be honest, I think is a reflection of reality today. Um, it's definitely a reflection of economic realities. When you look at economically, there are two countries that are economic superpowers: the United States and China. So that um, the fact that the U.S. president said that, acknowledged it, I think was a very important shift in U.S. policy from the previous 7 or 8 years. The policy, especially I think under President Joe Biden, the policy was much more. I think President Joe Biden split the world into, on the one hand, the quote unquote good guys who were the democracies and the bad guys who were the non-democracies. And and told Canada and Europe, you guys come in with us, and we're going to create a whole group against China and a whole group against Russia. Obviously, Trump lives in a very different world. Trump lives in a world of America first, and where whether a country is a democracy or not, he doesn't really care. What he cares about is power relationships. And to the extent that China is a powerful country, you've seen, I think, President Trump back away from trying to confront China head on. And I think backed away because he realized that actually confronting China head on would create some serious problems for the US economy, whether through rare earths, whether through magnets, whether through chemical compounds. The US was actually dependent on China for a lot of things. And so once that was acknowledged, I think that opened the door for a lot of other countries who do depend on the United States heavily, whether Canada, whether Europe, to also normalize their relationships with China. And I think that's what we're witnessing now is after 7 or 8 years where everybody has tried to isolate China, after 7 or 8 years where everybody has tried to cripple China economically, I think the acknowledgement is that this has failed. China is now economically actually stronger than it was a decade ago. It's more integrated in global supply chains than it was a decade ago. And so whether you're a European country, a Canada, pretty much anybody, you have to review your China strategy, your China policies, and I think that's what we're witnessing. That's why European leaders are coming to China. That's why Carney, Canada's prime minister, came to China. So this is the start of a new trend. After 7 or 8 years of trying to isolate China, the Western world is acknowledging that strategy failed, and I think we're now back into a far more positive relationship. I think pragmatism is the order of the day. Look, if we look back at the recent years between the West and China, the relationship broke down in 2018. This is when the Western world, well, especially the United States, weaponized the semiconductor industry against China. This is when the U.S. told Holland, Japan, Korea, etc. You guys aren't allowed to sell high-end semiconductors to China anymore. And I think if you were the Chinese leadership, that was a particularly scary moment because you thought, okay, the US is trying to cripple us economically and they're blocking us from semiconductors today. Tomorrow, if they want, they can block us from chemical products or auto parts or, they can block us from anything. So we have to de-Westernize our supply chains as quickly as possible. It was painful. It was a national strategic imperative, you could say, or the leadership felt it was an imperative. And it was a clear choice to say, okay, we're going to do this. It's going to be painful, but we have to do this. And having done this, now the Western world is stuck in a position where the Western world is now far more dependent on China than China is dependent on the Western world. And so the ability to put pressure on China really no longer is there. So from that assessment, now the Western world, and especially the United States, has a simple choice. They could say, okay, fine, we're going to do what China did over the past 7 years. We're going to de-Sinify our supply chain. They de-Westernize their supply chain. We're going to de-Sinify our supply chains. The problem with this is that this is very costly. Again, China took a lot of sacrifices to do this. Now, for the US to say, okay, fine, we're going to rebuild an aluminum industry. We're going to rebuild a rare earth processing industry. We're going to rebuild a shipping industry. Each one of these cost $1 trillion. Now, the US is already running budget deficits of $2 trillion a year. So if they're going to do this, they're going to need to get the money from somewhere else. So the bottom line is I think the Western world is realizing, okay, China de-Westernized their supply chain. We're not going to de-Sinify our supply chain because that would be too costly. It'd be political suicide. So we're not going to do this. So really, we have no choice but to get along better with China. So to you, it's a long-winded answer to your question, but I think pragmatism is starting to prevail. Now, it doesn't mean it's all going to go one way. It'll be 3 steps forward, 2 steps back. But I think in the top echelons of government, when you listen to Mark Carney, when you listen to Merz, when you listen to Starmer, like there's the acknowledgement that, you know what, we're not going to take the same kind of sacrifices that China took, so we have to get along with them. I think if you look at the US, on the one hand, you have the elected officials, basically Donald Trump, the president. And then you have, quote unquote, the deep state or the government apparatus, the people who work in government and who work there regardless of who gets elected. The people who work for the State Department, the people who work for the Defense Department, the people who work for the Commerce Secretary. And I think by and large, those people are very anti-China for a lot of reasons. So the government infrastructure is very anti-China, and you saw this just before the Trump Xi meeting, the Busan meeting. You'll remember that a week before, just before they were scheduled to meet, the Commerce Department added another, I think it was like 730 companies, Chinese companies, onto the banned list. And obviously, President Xi was very upset and said, fine, if this is what you're going to do, then we're going to put new restrictions on rare earths and new restrictions on magnets. And then Trump got upset, and then everything calmed down. When Trump realized that President Xi reacted to what the Commerce Department had done, and that Commerce Department had done this without talking to anybody in the White House. And President Trump was obviously visibly upset that the Commerce Department was trying to sabotage his meeting with Xi. So the order was given that nobody was allowed to do anything linked to China without first going through Stephen Miller. Now, Stephen Miller in the White House he's sort of the enforcer. He's sort of the bruiser of the Trump administration. So if Trump essentially said, look, you do anything on China without my authorization, you're going to have to deal with Stephen Miller, i.e. you're probably going to lose your job. So I do think there is this tension within the U.S. government between the sort of administration of government that remains anti-China and Trump that I think does want a better relationship. The U.S. has made it pretty clear, for example, that there's very narrow limits as to how much they'll allow Mexico or Canada to integrate with China. They're not keen at all on those two countries that are very close to the U.S. and with whom the U.S. has free trade deals and free trade organization, etc. There, I think there's some pretty strong red lines. But for others, I would say, if you've got skillful politicians, whether you're Brazil, whether you're Chile, whether you're in Indonesia, whether you're South Africa, if you've got good politicians, then actually the sort of US-China rivalry has been a great opportunity for you to try to play one against the other and get stuff from both. I think Indonesia has actually done that pretty decently. And to some extent, Chile, Colombia, Peru have done that very well as well. So the bottom line is, if neither China nor the US decide you're part of my core national strategic interest, then you have the ability to do deals with both. But if the China or the US decide you're part of my core national strategic interest, that narrows considerably the scope for playing one against the other. Especially now that the United States, with their new foreign policy, the new Donroe Doctrine, has essentially said, look, Latin America is ours, everybody else go away. Latin America is ours. I think if you're a Latin American country, you're a little more reluctant now to anger the United States. Having said that, you can still play your cards well. Look at Argentina. Argentina was going to go bust, and then essentially Milei said, well, if I'm going to go bust, maybe I'm going to ask China to come help. And the US said, no, don't do that. Here's 20 billion. If that's not enough, here's another 20 billion. The nation size does matter. And I would say also what the country produces and who its clients are. So if you're Canada, the problem you face today is that for the past 50 years, you've essentially built your economy to service the United States, whether for industry or for commodities. You never bothered to build pipelines or LNG terminals on your oceans, always had them facing south to sell to the United States. And so you're now facing a crisis where you say, okay, I need to de-Americanize my supply chains. Canada needs to de-Americanize not so much its supply chain as much as its client base. So that means building new pipelines. That means building LNG terminals. Now, you could say the good news for Canada, I think, is that there's a strong political realization of this point. Up until recently, building new pipelines was almost impossible because most of the left would always oppose them for environmental reasons, for indigenous rights reasons. But now all of a sudden, there's the perception that, okay, if we don't build them, we're going to remain dependent on Donald Trump and whoever follows him. And that's not a long-term proposition. If we want to be a genuine independent country, we actually need to diversify our client base. So we need to build the pipelines, we need to build the energy terminals, we need to sell more to Europe, we need to sell more to Japan, to Korea, to China. So deep down, I actually think that everything that's unfolding will turn out to be very bullish for Canada because they're going to finally get the infrastructure spending done that they've been needing to get done for 15 years and never did. Never did because politically it was hard, and that now there's a political realization that okay, we need to get it done. So let's make it happen. Never say never, but the more when you say acting collectively, look, my core belief is in Lord Palmerstom's dictum that nations have no permanent friends and no permanent enemies, just permanent interests. And today, I do think that the global South does have a number of interests that overlap. Now, is that enough to make a new global world order? I'm not sure, but it's definitely enough to somewhat change the global financial architecture. It's definitely enough to get trade deals done. But I think that the story of the story of the post World War II era was a story of multi-country institutions like the European Union or like NATO or like the World Bank or the IMF. And I wonder whether we're not coming to the exhaustion of these multi-country institutions, and we're moving increasingly into a world of bilateral relations. So Indonesia has a relationship with the United States. Indonesia has a relationship with China. You define what the relationship is for trade. You define what the relationship is for financial flows. You work in a way that makes everybody happy. And you don't need to do it on a broad framework where you also have to get ASEAN involved so that Malaysia also agrees and Thailand also agrees, etc. It's like, no, Indonesia is going to look out for what's best for Indonesia, and Thailand is going to look out for what's best for Thailand, and it makes more work because it's a lot of work for diplomats, etc. But deep down, it's perhaps more efficient. If you want to focus today on what is perhaps the biggest risk, is if you look everywhere around the world right now, everybody, literally every major government, whether Japan, United States, Europe, China, everybody is running very easy fiscal policies. I mean, China this year is going to run budget deficits of 10% of GDP. US is going to run budget deficit of 6.5%, maybe 7% of GDP. So everybody is stepping on the gas, every government. And at the same time, every central bank is being very easy. So in such an environment, the risk, I don't think, is on the deflationary side. The risk isn't on the balance sheet recession side. The risk is that inflation accelerates. Now, here's the interesting thing, is if you look around the world today, inflation in the US, in Japan, in Europe, it is high. It's somewhat uncomfortably high. China is the one major economy in the world that really has no inflation problem. If anything, China has a deflation problem. It doesn't have an inflation problem. So China today really has no policy constraints. The reason governments can't run budget deficits, the reason you can't put interest rates at zero is when there is inflation in the system. That's when governments are forced to be restrictive. China clearly doesn't have this issue. China, again, will be running budget deficits of 10% of GDP this year. And if that's not enough, they can do 12, they can do 14. So China essentially has no policy constraint right now because there is no inflation in China. Um, so, having said all this, and to answer your question, what's the risk for the global economy? The risk for the global economy is inflation accelerates. Now, how would this happen? This would happen if oil prices started to rise. Now, they are creeping higher. They're not like shooting up. You've gone from $55, $60 to $65, $70, partly on the back of Iran risks, partly on the back of geopolitical uncertainties, etc. But and for now, to be very clear, oil prices are not a problem. But I worry for the coming year or two, I worry much more about a spike in energy price and what that could potentially do to the global economy than I worry about balance sheet recessions or anything like that. I think the difference between Japan and China, there's similarities, which is why a lot of people have concluded that China would be like Japan, and you've got falling real estate prices, bad demographics, so there are similarities. I think that for me, the first big difference is that yes, China had a real estate bubble, but the real estate bubble in China was nowhere near as big as the real estate bubble in Japan. The real estate bubble in Japan was truly like no bubble we've ever seen. You're too young to know this, but back in 1989, you had a shop that sold in Ginza. Ginza is a fancy neighborhood of Tokyo. You had a shop that sold for $1 million a square meter. Now, in 1989, $1 million was a lot of money. It still is a lot of money, but in 1989, it was really a lot of money. It was estimated that the land on which the Imperial Palace sits in the middle of Tokyo was worth more than the whole of California. I mean, this is how crazy things got in Japan. And it got so crazy that pretty much every business company quoted on the stock market was valued on the basis of their real estate. So you say, oh, okay, this widget maker, they make widget, but who cares about that? They're sitting on a piece of land that's worth X, and so the stock price should be X times 2. And so you had a huge real estate bubble, a huge equity market bubble, and when it imploded, essentially all the banks went bust. And so that's one big difference between China and Japan, is that in China, the real estate has gone bust, prices have gone down a third, etc. But you haven't had all the banks go bust, and especially not the major banks, because even though you did have a real estate bubble in China, it was nowhere near as big. And so the cushioning the cushions the banks automatically have turned out to be big enough to absorb that. So that's, I think, the first difference. I think a second massive difference, to be honest, is that the amount that foreigners held in Japanese assets. People forget this, but in 1989, Japan was 45% of the world MSCI. The world MSCI is essentially the global equity market benchmark. So every global investor had to be invested in Japan, and they had typically half of their money invested in Japan. So when it started to go down, all the foreigners left, and that provided wave of selling after wave of selling after wave of selling. This is simply not true for China. China is a very small part of global indices, and foreign investors were never that big a part of the stock market. So I think that's a second big difference. I think a third massive difference between China and Japan was that Japan, by the time it went bust, was stupidly expensive on every front. And it was deeply uncompetitive pretty much across the board. The joke back in the 1990s and 2000s, even after Japan had started to go bust, was that if you went for dinner in Tokyo, you needed to get a second mortgage on your house just to pay for the dinner. People were talking about, like, you'd go to the supermarkets, apples would cost $20 each, $20 each. So this is completely different from China. Anybody who traveled to Tokyo in the 90s and 2000s would come back and say, oh my God, this place is so expensive. Anybody who travels to China today says, I can't believe how cheap it is. World-class hotels for not that much money. Brand new, very efficient trains for not that much money. Some of the world's best cars for a fraction of the price of cars everywhere else in the world. So on and so on and so on. So China today is massively, massively competitive in a way that Japan simply wasn't back then. And you see this, and I'll stop there, but you see this in the difference between the Japanese trade surplus at the time and the Chinese trade surplus today. China's trade surplus today is roughly 100 billion US dollars a month. To put things in perspective, it's basically 1.3 trillion a year. That's the same size as the Saudi Arabia's GDP. Now, you've never had a country run a trade surplus this big. This trade surplus is a testimony for me of China's deep, deep, deep competitiveness. I look at currencies a little bit like computer operating systems. And so in financial world in which I inhabit, everybody uses Microsoft. Everybody uses Excel, everybody uses PowerPoint. And one of the reasons everybody uses Microsoft is not that they love Microsoft. It's the reason they use it is everybody else uses Microsoft. So if you jump from one job to the next, you can assume that they know how to use Excel, you can assume that they know how to use PowerPoint, etc. So currencies are the operating system of our world, and the US dollar is the Microsoft of the world, and that everybody uses the US dollar because everybody else uses the US dollar. Now, to replace the US dollar, you don't need to have something a little bit better. You need to have something that's a lot better. Now, I think the big challenge for the renminbi is obvious enough. The renminbi sort of fails at the first hurdle to be a reserve currency, which is that if you want to be a major reserve currency, you need to give people a lot of assets that they can buy in your currency. If people are going to keep reserves in renminbi, then they need the assets to buy. They need bonds, they need real estate, they need equities. So inherently, this means you need to open capital controls. You need to tell the foreigners, look, you can buy and sell assets here as much as you want. Like foreigners can buy and sell assets in the US as much as they want. Now, I think that conceptually, of course, China could open capital controls. That's very much a political decision. It could totally do it, but there's very little signs that this is what President Xi wants. That Xi Jinping or Li Chong, there's little signs that they want to open capital controls because keeping close capital controls, having a reserve currency is a great advantage, no doubt about it. But having close capital accounts also provides great advantages. So do you want to give up one for the other? For me, that's the big quandary. So I was quite surprised, to be honest, when in February, all these remarks from Xi Jinping were published about how he wants the renminbi to become a reserve currency. Now, at the time, when the remarks first came out, I thought, well, I don't think he means it. And I was somewhat uncomfortable with that conclusion because I actually think Chinese leaders have a decent track record of doing what they say and saying what they do. But when he made those remarks, I thought, you know what? I think he's just signaling that he wants a stronger renminbi, which I think is today one of the policy goals of China. They want the renminbi to go up. So I thought, okay, they're just signaling that, and that's part of the rhetoric. And then last weekend, Joseph Yam, who used to be the HKMA, the Hong Kong Monetary Authority, the Hong Kong Central Bank governor, who's now retired, was interviewed on here in Hong Kong on TV. You can find the interview on YouTube. It's in Cantonese. But and he was asked this very question. He was asked, look, President Xi says that he wants the renminbi to be a reserve currency, but if you're a foreigner, really the only renminbi assets that don't suffer from capital controls is the CNH bond market in Hong Kong, and that's roughly 1.3 trillion renminbi, so that's 200 billion US dollars. That's not enough, that's too small. That can never work. And Joseph Yam said something fascinating. He said, yeah, but one thing we could do is make the Hong Kong stock market, not just the bond market, but stock market also renminbi denominated. Um, and all of a sudden I thought, hold on, if they turn the Hong Kong stock market into an RMB stock market, then you move from foreigners being able to buy 1 trillion worth of renminbi assets to being able to buy 41 trillion of renminbi assets, because it's roughly 40 trillion RMB market cap here. So now you're talking proper size. Now you're talking, now all of a sudden you're offering a lot of assets for foreigners to potentially buy. So the reason I smiled is if you'd asked me 2 weeks ago, what are the odds of the renminbi becoming a reserve currency? I would have said essentially zero, and I would have laughed it off. And now I'm not so sure. Now I'm not so sure. All of a sudden, I don't think the odds are zero anymore. I think you're seeing it happen very slowly, bit by bit. Um, I think we're still a long ways away from countries like France or Germany deciding to keep savings in renminbi. But look, you already have countries like Ethiopia, Zambia, Kenya that have said we're going to transfer all of our US dollar debt into renminbi debt. So if increasingly China is your biggest trade partner, and not only is China your biggest trade partner, but if also China is now your biggest creditor, it's your biggest provider of capital, then all of a sudden you have an institutional backdrop where you think, well, why am I saving in US dollars when I'm borrowing money from China and from Chinese banks? China's providing my infrastructure spending, and China's buying most of my goods and resources or services. Then it sort of makes sense to start drifting towards the renminbi. And so I think what you're starting to see around the world is that happening first with, I would say, the smaller emerging markets. Then over time it'll grow. So the obvious, I think it'll grow slowly, first with China's immediate neighbors. So the Indonesias, the Thailands, the Malaysia, etc., and the commodity producing and exporting countries. So most of Africa, Central Asia, and the like. But I think it'll take a really long time before the other industrial countries, i.e., the Europeans, North Americans, etc., transact in renminbi. I think that'll take a very long time.
Now, you have been watching China Now here on Pan African Television. On today's program, we examined renewed trade tension between China and the United States, China's humanitarian response to a crisis in Iran, and the growing impacts of the new technologies from artificial intelligence to advanced robotics. We also had expert perspectives on the shifting global order and what it could mean for diplomacy, economics, and international stability. Please share with us your thoughts and feedbacks through the email provided below. I am Stanley Koblako.